Get ready to see my favorite animal, the tuatara. It's a lizard that arrived here at the zoo the same year I started teaching. Melissa, they have retired my duster.
Retired like my Uncle Anthony or retired like my Uncle Tony?
Welcome back to Restorative Justice Reflections. I'm David Ryan Barcega Castro Harris, all 5 names for all the ancestors, and today I'm here with Felina Rodriguez to dive deep into the restorative themes, or lack thereof, found in Season 1, Episode 13 of ABC's hit show Abbott Elementary, Zoo Balloon. This is the finale of Season 1, and as always, our conversation here is not to critique the story or production choices of the creators, but we'll highlight how restorative justice could apply to navigating career transitions, being vulnerable with students, and figuring out what it means to be a good teacher. Hopefully, this will give you some insight about how to apply restorative ways of being into your life, in and out of the classroom. If you want to take a deeper look at applying restorative justice to your life, join our Inner Circle community to connect with RJ-minded individuals and get bonus content. Deepen your practice by checking out our courses. And if you want to see this work in your school or organization, invite us for coaching or training on implementing this work. Of course, the links to everything down below. Now let's get to it. Felina, so good to have you. Tell us about yourself.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here. I am ending, I should say, my 6th year in education. I focus predominantly in secondary education. So I have taught students 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, and now 11th grade.
What do you teach?
I teach U.S. history, and I also teach a new course that we've built on our campus, which is U.S. history through a Mexican-American lens, but in the higher education field, it's known as Chicano Studies, or Chicanx Studies now.
Absolutely. And, you and I have collaborated a number of times within the context of Amplify RJ, highlighting the importance of Chicanx studies in, as we navigate life as people, right? In a pluralistic society, or a society that is in some ways and shapes and forms attempting to be more pluralistic, but also as it comes to the importance of affirming students' identities within the classroom. So thank you so much for all of your work. But let's talk about Abbott, right? You're a high school teacher. This isn't a show set in a high school, but you can still relate. In what ways?
Yes, and it's also because I have a lot of respect for elementary teachers in particular, because the K through 5 system is a whole different beast in the things you encounter day to day. And so I always have had a lot of respect for the kinder, 1st, and 2nd grade teachers, because I happen to have both the benefit, and some people would call it a curse, but I love my job, of being able to teach students when they're grown, and there are certain skills that you don't necessarily have to teach at the secondary level.
I'm going to read the summary loosely based off of what Wikipedia tells us. So in this episode, Abbott Elementary takes their annual year-end school field trip to the Philadelphia Zoo with Tariq, Taylor, and Zach in tow, serving as additional chaperones, while Mr. Johnson, the janitor, is left supervising the students without their permission slips. Tariq gets an opportunity to move to New York to record an anti-drug themed rap album, and Janine is not sure if she wants to leave Abbott to go to New York with him. While they're at the zoo, Janine is pondering this, and Barb is pondering her future at the school when she sees that her favorite zoo animal is retired due to old age. Gregory tells Janine that this next school year he'll be a full-time teacher at Abbott, and Janine ultimately decides to break up with Tariq and not move to New York with him, as they are all left reflecting on their remaining choices for the rest of the school year. So when we think about this episode, there's a lot of transitions happening, and I think that's what we want to think about when we're coming to this idea of transition and change. What stood out to you, and how can we put it through a restorative lens?
There are a few moments that stood out to me, in particular the transition of careers and the decision of whether or not to stay within the field of education and within the classroom. And then, of course, the other piece being how we finally decide when someone is considered a veteran teacher. Because for me, it's every year within my teaching career, and I've been doing this for 6 years, there's a moment in the school year where I have to decide. I start questioning my life choices. and whether I'm going to come back next year. And you see teachers in different phases of their teaching career making that decision for themselves. So that struck a chord with me a lot. And then, of course, what ultimately dictates what a veteran teacher is.
And we see that a couple ways, right? One, like Gregory has made his decision that, like, I'm going to be a teacher, right? And we think about like all of the things that have led up to this in this season, him wanting to be a principal, him substituting, him struggling as a substitute, him making the decision not to like go after Ava's job and decide that, hey, I'm going to like develop my teaching practice and, be in proximity to Janine, of course, right? But those are choices that he's making based off of, the environment that Abbott's provided for him, the support that he's gotten from teachers. We have Janine, who, like, we know is like, I was born to do this. I need to do this, like, for the kids. Can I do this in New York? Right? We have Barbara, who is like all definitely in on being a teacher for her whole life, but as she's reflecting on her 30 plus years, like, do I want to continue to do this? How have you navigated those moments where you're questioning whether or not you want to stick with it?
For me, what I think about is, let's see how I feel over a summer after I've had a chance to take care of myself, after I've had a chance to just breathe, and see if I feel like I'm going to do this again. Because what works personally for me is being able to have those breaks and being able to decide when I feel centered, okay, do I still feel like I want to be in education or not? And I'm one of the people that decides to go back and come back the next year. So that's kind of the conversation I have with myself. And I'm not going to lie, every year I've been teaching, I have had one day where I go home and I just cry. And you feel better after crying. That's just something that happens. But it also speaks to the difficulty of the job that we have. And I can completely understand when people feel like it's their time to go and not continue education.
Yeah. And the work that you do is so appreciated. And I think like one of my favorite moments of this episode is like, I think it's like the final ending tag where Mr. Johnson has had this kids who had to stay behind, like write an essay about like who their superheroes, like what their superpower would be, or like who their favorite superhero was. And they have this beautiful essay about why their teachers are their heroes, why they have superpowers.
Dear Mr. Johnson, we know we couldn't go to the zoo because we didn't have signed permission slips. But we think it's bananas to make us write about what superhero is our favorite.
Because our real heroes are our teachers. They don't have cool powers like Spider-Man or invisible cars like Wonder Woman. Some of them can't afford cars, but they still are our heroes. Does that answer your question? Sincerely yours, the Abbott Elementary Breakfast Club.
And I think what gets lost for folks when we're thinking about restorative justice is that, yes, we're thinking about like, how do we build, strengthen, and repair relationships rooted in equity and trust in our classrooms, in our school environments, but like also the relationship with yourself is really important, right? I know you get a lot of kind words and affirmation from students, families, sometimes even your colleagues, and people like maybe those at the coffee shop who are like, goodness, like I could never do, like, bless you, right? But the conversation that you have to have with yourself, being in right relationship with yourself, like knowing that you're subjecting yourself to suboptimal work conditions, right, to do something that you care deeply about, is something that like we can do in a rather restorative, balanced way, or like in a very like martyr like approach. And like that's not what I heard from you, but like how do you prevent yourself from getting into like that I'm gonna like give everything that I have for this?
Yeah, and that's something I wish someone had told me in my first year teaching, because the way we prepare teachers in this current system, and I can only speak for Arizona just because I've only taught in my home state of Arizona. But when we prepare teachers for teaching, a lot of it is focused on theory and practice and pedagogy. And newsflash, none of what you've studied in teacher college or teacher preparation programs can ever prepare you for being in front of, my largest class has been 34. So 34 young people with their own individual needs and their own individual ways of doing things, all who are going through puberty, who are, their brain is wired to push limits to see what they can and cannot do. And you have to be the grown up to show them what is a healthy response to a pushed limit or a broken boundary. So it's like theory can never match practice. But for me, I have been very intentional in realizing, okay, maybe my grading wasn't updated every 2 weeks, but I did get it done within that 2 week, 1 day off window. Or maybe I didn't grade everything, but that's okay. Don't grade everything. Design your classroom so that you have smaller amounts to grade, which is why I don't give homework, because I'm not going to grade it. The kids don't want to do it. Why bother? And so those are the limits I've set for myself. And then, of course, I set my hours between 7:30 and 5 o'clock is the latest I stay. Maybe if there's an event, I'll stay afterwards, but I refuse to take any of my papers home. So that's the limit I have to set for myself in my work-life balance, because for teachers, we are kind of taught or expected that we shouldn't have one. And that is so dangerous and treats us like martyrs, because then we're told, but it's for the children, but it's for this. And for me, being a brown woman in education, I also remember this education system was never designed for me to survive. So I have had to create my own way of surviving and my own system. And I do know that I've had a lot of time to try and practice it, but it's taken me 6 years. I am telling you now, my first, second, and third years teaching, I feel like I've made a lot of mistakes, and I can never take back the mistakes and the harm I inflicted on students, whether it was intentional or unintentional, but you do improve over time. And so those are kind of like the parameters I've set for myself. And then I do take into account the advice that one of my teacher mentors told me. And it's the minute you start resenting what you do and the minute you start feeling negative only towards the students, that's when you know you have to leave. Because at that point, it's no longer about helping students and doing the job you were trained to do. You become trapped in this cycle where you're doing this for the paycheck. And that's not healthy for you. And it's not healthy for the students in front of you.
And it just doesn't make economic sense because
No.
there are a lot more ways that you can get paid more money. You talked a little bit about, your growth as a teacher. We see Janine, and I think in the first season of Abbott Elementary, I believe this is her second year teaching. And you mentioned some of those mistakes. We've seen lots of things that Janine has done over this first season that we've talked about in previous episodes, right? But when you think about her in this episode, what were the things that you saw in yourself, or things that made you go, oh, or like, I'm proud of you?
For me, there were a few. The first is realizing just that the greatest fear a lot of teachers have is losing a student while you're on a field trip. I have had nightmares about this because it is such a real fear. And so seeing how Janine is able to handle it by talking to the student, and I did like the way she built a relationship with fearful students, because in Arizona, one of the changes we see in our approach to pedagogy is diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I know there's an entire podcast on why that may or may not work in educational systems. But our school district in particular is like relationships. But we're never told how to build those. And it just starts by just talking to students and meeting them when they're at. So like when a student is fearful, the steps she took in speaking to the student and like maintaining a somewhat sense of calm, because when you're in a balloon, it's not easy to maintain a sense of calm. So I did appreciate that, and just even finding the student, because it's always been a nightmare to lose a student in a field trip, and this is when I've taken a group of middle schoolers to the state fair. So it is a kind of somewhat organized chaos.
Yeah, that moment in the balloon was really important. I think a lot of the times teachers and people, adults in the world, feel like they have to like be like brave and not show emotions. But like Janine admits her fear to the student, right?
Sometimes the best things you can ever do are the scary things. And they help you grow. And you're gonna have a pretty cool teacher to help you every step of the way. So we're gonna do this together, you know? We're going to love it, even if it scares us.
So now do you love being on this balloon?
No, I'm still very scared, but I'm gonna try to be brave and stand up. Okay.
Let's look over the side.
Oh, not that brave yet.
And like while they're not going through the same circumstances, in the show, she's talking to the student about like what's going on in her life, really. But like that kind of vulnerability is important. I think there are limits to what vulnerability looks like from a teacher to a student, but showing students that you're a whole person who has similar fears, has had experiences that are similar to what your students are going through, like can be an incredible way to continue to build relationships.
Yeah, and there are definitely limits to what you can say to your students because again, you're trying to be a role model. So me being a 26-year-old, I can't tell them what I as a 26-year-old do on my weekends. But when we talk about vulnerability with students, my students came into class today. We're like 4 or 5 weeks away from the end of the school year. We're all tired. I think Mercury is in retrograde. So when they came in, they're like, "How are you doing, miss?" And I'm like, "I just want to go home." And they're like, "Me too. We agree." And I designed our day to be a short mini lesson and then we get work time. And I did see some of them take a nap, but we're all exhausted. And I understand. So I'm not going to hold it against you. So like those little pieces of vulnerability, just being honest that this job is also taxing, creates that understanding with students too. Because in our teacher prep programs, a lot of the narrative is that we have to be this perfect person that 100% regulates their emotions, that understands the rigid lines of discipline. And that's just not human, and it's not going to work.
Ooh, you said one of the buzzwords that we have to dissect when you say on these airwaves, right? When you say discipline, what does that mean?
Ooh, okay. So this is where I get to go back to my ethnic studies practices and even within the own Indigenous knowledge systems that I am a part of. When we talk about the idea of discipline in education, it carries a negative connotation. But we have this idea of self-discipline, meaning the way I present myself and have this presentation of who I am and my character. And it is so shocking when I talk to students about this idea of self-discipline that we're here not just for me, but for my ancestors and people who will come after me. This is the first time they've ever heard that discipline doesn't have to be negative. And so that is something I always think of because when my students first meet me during the first semester, a lot of it is unlearning what we have been taught in a colonial school system. And then when we get to the second semester, that's when like all the fun things happen because we've spent 18 weeks getting to know each other.
Yeah. I also think about, right, even thinking about like colonial structures, the word discipline has been co-opted, right? Because discipline in Latin, like disciplis, like means to teach, right? And so when you said like rigid discipline, right? Like discipline isn't bad, right? Like what are the ways that we're conducting ourselves, right? What are the ways that we're going to learn? What are the things that we're trying to teach people? And the method that we go about using when we're trying to teach folks is very important. It doesn't have to look like punishment. So, you said the word. I just want to make sure that like people have that orientation when we say it.
Yeah, and it's interesting you bring that up because I just realized in Spanish, disciplina is not a negative connotation. It's more of that concept of self-discipline. But disciplinar, when you are doing the action of creating discipline or acting discipline on someone else, that one has the negative connotation, which I realize is very interesting just because I grew up in a Spanish-speaking household. That kind of shifted my way of thinking of the word discipline. Sometimes, but Spanish is a very subjective language. So the way my mom used the word disciplina, she's like, necesitas disciplina. Like, you got to set a routine for yourself. You got to be doing your homework at this point in time because it's going to help you in the future. Or you have to like go to bed at a certain time. That's the way she taught us about the word disciplina. But when I use it in conversations to interpret with parents, like today we translated about the student handbook, we use the word disciplinar, meaning the consequences or discipline practices of what you do when a fight breaks out.
That framing of discipline doesn't have to be negative either, right? Because like that's what, when we're saying that, we're talking about punishment. Yeah. And that's not what discipline means, right? So we have all the things that are going on with Janine, but the other thing that, you know, you're not necessarily like 30 years into your job, but I know a lot of people are thinking about transitioning, or there are some people who have more years in the game who can relate to what Barbara's going through. What came up for you when you were witnessing that?
It's something I've noticed amongst my teacher colleagues who've been in the profession longer than I have. And the reason I bring that up is because if you think, and again, I'm a history teacher, so my math is rusty, but 30 years back would have been the early 2000s, which means most teacher training programs would have been in the 80s and 90s, before the first iPhone, before YouTube, before Google, and back when you used the World Book Encyclopedia, where you had to put in a CD in the computer and then take it out and put a different CD in the computer to find information. And education has changed so much within that span of time. And the students have changed so much within that span of time. And I'm speaking as like a relatively young teacher in comparison to my colleagues. And many of them do feel, especially with the pandemic and how we had to turn towards technology, many teachers who were within that 20, 30-year veteran space felt overwhelmed and felt like they could no longer call themselves veteran teachers because the profession had changed so much. So I did see that a lot, because it is painful to realize when some of the things you thought you were fantastic at are kind of outdated. And I'm saying this as a 26-year-old when my students tell me that the Nintendo NES is an ancient artifact. And so the 90s are the new vintage and retro, and I'm learning to understand what that means. And so I do understand from observation of my peers how Barbara must feel, because that is a very tough position when you think about it. And time is a very strange thing. So that's what I've noticed, of course, but it's also, there is no such thing as a teacher who knows everything. You can have 30 years of experience, but if you're following carceral or colonial practices within your classroom, can you really say you are a good teacher? And even like, what is a good teacher? Because at this point, I am welcoming anyone to please tell me, because all of us are still figuring it out, even after the 5-year milestone.
If you're appreciating this video, like to help us in the YouTube algorithm, subscribe so you won't miss a video, and share it with someone to help us further amplify this work. Now back to the show. One of the things that we've seen over the course of the show is how Barbara has been propped up as like the model teacher and like the perfect example. And, you know, over the course of the show, and definitely into season 2, we see some of the ways that like she's not, right? Nobody is. Janine puts her on that pedestal and is so desperate for her approval. And when we come to the end of this episode,
You've come a long way, Miss Teagues. And I'm happy you're staying at Abbott. It's where you belong.
Thank you, Mrs. Howard.
Excuse me. Sit down.
when we see demonstrations of discipline, right, or correction in that vein being glorified, right, what does that say about what we're expecting for teachers to be quote unquote good?
As I navigated my first year in education, I gravitated towards the teachers who we saw as veterans. The teachers that I looked up to did not have restorative practices within their classrooms and actually followed the punitive systems that many of us are taught within a teacher preparation program or a teacher education program. So I'm never going to forget a student I had my first year teaching, because I modeled what I saw, but I will own up to the fact that I did cause harm. I would tell students, sit down, or point to a desk, sit, and then realize, and the student responded to me, I'm not a dog. Don't talk to me like a dog. And that has stuck with me forever because I'm remembering what I thought what teaching was and how it harmed students. And having to own up to that and still seeing that being shown in a TV show where the epitome of being a veteran teacher is that you say one word and students will do immediately what you say, it still presents the problem of power dynamics in education, where the teacher is presented as the authoritarian figure and students are expected to listen and obey, which is unfortunately still our school practice, because if you look at referral forms or school handbooks, defiance is still a referral form practice. It's still something you can send a student and write up a student for a referral.
And I imagine that there are people who are engaging with something around restorative justice who are like, yeah, Felina, you tell him. And I imagine that there are some people who are like, if you don't want me to treat you like a dog, stop acting like one, right? Like, that's just the way that we are training you to be in the world, right? We're expecting compliance. The people who you're going to engage with in the world are going to expect compliance. I think a lot of the times with school teachers of color, right? When I think about this kind of model being handed down by teachers of color, Black teachers, Indigenous teachers, right? Sometimes it's rooted in, hey, we just want to prepare you for the way that the world is going to treat you. And I think that is well-intentioned, but we can also build a world where students aren't treated like that. Why do we, the people who are supposed to care for them, understand them, have shared experience with them, have to treat them the same way, right? All of this is rooted in behavior control, in enslavement, right? In colonialism, controlling the Negroes, right? Controlling the savages, right? It's white supremacy 101. And while I'm not saying that Janine or Miss Howard in this situation were the extreme of that, right? That is the thing that is replicated so often in schools. And to see that glorified in that moment as like, yeah, Janine's a good teacher now. I don't know what to do with that.
It's hard because what I have noticed with in my own classroom, and there's memes about it on Bored Teachers, which is a page that has funny videos and skits that I laugh about. But you still see kind of those patterns emerging there too, where there, and think specifically about a meme where it's veteran, first year teachers like 1, 2, 3, eyes on me, or like all the different attention getters that you can think of, and then veteran teacher is just glares. And I've noticed with my own practice, I more say now, I'm not going to talk over you, because the students, because we've built enough of a mutual understanding, and I want to say I've tried to make my classroom more engaging and fun, because there's this misconception that history can't be fun and it must be history. But if I'm going to teach the Red Scare and I can't incorporate Among Us and kind of make it a fun game, then what am I in the classroom for? And so like using those activities, and the students by now know that I'm trying to see what they like and what they don't like. They have understood, oh, I as a person want to be heard, and so I'm not going to talk over another person. So like it takes time. It is not easy, but I have noticed that there are ways to engage your students and have your students listen to you based on an understanding of mutual respect that does not have to be authoritarian. And also, I teach secondary students, and I know most teacher education programs tell you not to be sarcastic with students, but this is kind of like our love language and humor language, where we use witty banter to talk to each other. And it's not done in a way that to harm or make fun of a student, but it's like a kind of humor that they laugh about, but also kind of get the point, like, hey, okay, we need to do what we came here to do.
You know, I've talked to a lot of teachers over the course of my time doing restorative justice work within the context of schools. And sometimes teachers are like, but I've been doing this for so long. This is what the students are used to. And the beautiful thing about restorative justice is that, like, hey, it's not just that like we're repairing like moments of harm. Like we can go back and build and strengthen relationships, change patterns that we've built up, right? It's not too late to adapt, right? Even if you're, a couple weeks away from the end of the school year, you can talk about, hey, the way that we've been operating isn't necessarily the way that I want to be in relationship with you all. What would it look like for the rest of this year to operate out of more mutual respect? What is it that you need in this classroom? And this is what I need in this classroom, right? You're not a passive participant in your classroom, right? You're a full participant. You get to articulate your needs to your students. But, when you do this collaboratively and then you have conversations about, all right, this is the way that we want to be. What are we going to do when we're not this way? Because it's inevitably going to happen, right? The way that they want to be corrected is something that you can engage in.
I also know that for someone who has done something a certain way for a really long time, it's kind of hard to embrace something new because you don't know how it will go. For me, the way I have kind of gotten over that is you never know until you try. So I tell the students, we're going to try something new, see how it goes. And depending on how the activity or the lesson goes, the next day or after that, I'll tell them, okay, that did not go as planned. So let's try XYZ or let's try something new. Even with humor as well, I am finding out right now my pop culture references that I've been using for the past 5 years are becoming outdated. Because when I thought I was being funny, when I asked my students, if you can find Genovia on this map of World War I will give you extra credit. Me personally thinking that everybody had seen The Princess Diaries and understood Genovia was the fictional country. And then I came to the realization that my students had not been born yet when the movie came out. And it was something they had seen when they were little or their older sibling had seen. So like realizing something I hadn't done, that I've been doing for a while has changed, that teaches me, okay, maybe I need to learn what is trending now or what's relevant to today's youth. What do they value? And I have the benefit of having a younger sister who is of the same generation as my students. So I've recently started watching One Piece, and that's the way I've kind of adapted to changes in education. But when you've had something for the same few years, I'm at this struggle where if you're not willing to change or adapt, I guess the word change is not the right one I'm using. It's the word adapt. When you're not willing to adapt in an education system that will constantly change, what are we in here for? Because new generations are going to learn differently. Now, in today's day and age, history is not so much about facts and figures because we have Google. So and ChatGPT. So the way I have to teach something has to look very different than what it did when I was going through school. And that's just normal. But I know there is a struggle with change, and there is a struggle with trying something new, and there's a struggle with being vulnerable and having funny moments with your students that I know not everyone is ready for, but that raises the question, if you're not ready for it, then do you feel like you should continue in education? Because the change is going to come, and the students are going to push you into that change, whether we're ready for it or not.
You've heard from us. Now we want to hear from you. Drop your restorative justice reflections in the comments. And if you want to join a live community conversation about our restorative justice lessons from Abbott Elementary, join us for a live event on Monday, July 31st. Link with more info in the description. And, over the course of this show going into season 2, we're going to see a lot of change, a lot of growth from all the characters involved. Teaching is an ever-evolving profession, right? And as we come to a close with season 1 of Abbott Elementary, we're going to see a lot of different growth points for all of the characters on Abbott Elementary. But I'm curious, if you were to be cast in your dream role on Abbott Elementary, what would your role be? Who would you play?
If I were to be cast and added to Abbott Elementary, there is this position that we have in a high school where you sometimes take your high school students and they do mentorship programs with elementary school students. And I have taken my students on a trip through a program we ran like this. So I would love to be like the high school teacher that shows up and builds a partnership with the students in that way, just because it's an easy way to see a dynamic between elementary school teachers and the different vibe of what secondary school teachers are, and like see that interaction, because the differences in our professions is also reflected in the differences of our personalities at times. Because as a secondary educator, I have a very different approach to what my students do than what a K-5 elementary teacher is. And this is not a generalization. It's just because we have to be around different age ranges. So some of our personality kind of molds into those. And it'd just be really fun for this random high school teacher to just show up to happy hour with Miss Shimenti and Barbara.
Your lips to Quinta and the writer's ears. As we're drawing to a close, is there anything else that you want to shout out or draw attention to while you've got the mic?
I just want to give a shout out to the Instagram that I run, which is at Teaching with Corazon. If you have any questions related to my work in education. But I also want to highlight the ongoing fact that Arizona in particular is facing attacks in its education system. And as of right now, our superintendent of public instruction created a hotline challenging that whether or not we should teach social emotional learning in the classrooms, challenging whether or not we should teach about race, ethnicity, and gender identity in the classroom, to the point where he's created a climate where teachers can be reported for teaching such things. And if you would like to become involved in supporting Arizona school teachers, whether it's, supporting our donors choose when they become public, or wanting to be connected to our community organizations that are continuing the battles with our state legislator and our state superintendent, feel free to send me a message at Teaching with Corazon on Instagram. And I am just really happy to be a part of this ongoing community in restorative justice.
Thank you so much for all your wisdom stories, experiences that you shared with us as we reflected on the season 1 finale of Abbott Elementary.